When you watch the film Home Alone, what sort of emotional and/or psychological response does it elicit from you? If you browse Google and YouTube for analyzations or interpretations of the film, they're all usually centered around some of its more secondary aspects, such as the physics behind the traps Kevin develops, or the precise medical injuries that Marv and Harry would sustain in realistic scenarios, but nothing that really focuses on plot details. That's because the mainstream perception of the film is that it's just a simple family Christmas movie that is not meant to push an agenda or provoke the public with its message. In fact, how could such a narrative be interpreted by someone when the film is entirely aimed at entertaining the audience with its radiant holiday imagery, slapstick humor, and overall heartwarming feel? While this is what's commonly taken away from Home Alone, there's actually a far darker and more upsetting message being pushed by the film, with this being the true narrative the film is attempting to convince the audience of, and you may in all honesty not realize that this is even present because of all of those other distractions that the film has going for it that I just previously mentioned. And if you're wondering exactly why I'm releasing a video about a Christmas-themed movie in the middle of July, pretty much the complete opposite of that season, it's because 1. I don't care, and 2. It's because this is fundamentally not a Christmas movie, but rather a disturbing piece of classist propaganda meant to further stigmatize the troubles poor people face in a brutally capitalistic American society, and in high contrast to a spoiled child who ultimately receives no punishments despite acting as a selfish foil for the rest of his family, due to the inherently discriminatory perception many of the upper-class Americans depicted in this film have for the lower class. While that may sound like a disingenuous characterization for the film, as most people only usually focus on its family-friendly aspects, such as the serious regret Kevin's family may have for mistreating and eventually abandoning him on Christmas, I'm about to unveil some of the qualities and themes this film has surrounding its negative depiction of poor people and individuals who are financially lower class, and how they are turned into the villains of the story, despite all of the atrocious things the rich McAllister family may have done as well. And when you witness this placed within its proper context, your characterization of the film may forever change, and you may find yourself tuning into a different film to watch for the holidays. But before we begin dissecting the film directly, we have to discuss the societal implications of poor people and how the film mostly revolves around the systemic, centuries-long oppression and dehumanization of them. Poor people, and individuals who are generally considered to be lower or working class in society, are one of the most definable groups of people who are innately discriminated against, along with women and people with disabilities. That is, no matter which nation it is on the planet, no matter their history nor ethnic background, poor people will face some inherent oppression from the rest of wider society because they are a perennial demographic, just like the aforementioned women and disabled people. Therefore, discrimination against poor people is one of the most common and universal forms of oppression because of how pervasive and recognizable it is in a culture. Every society has its population of less privileged people, with this group going back thousands of years. Because of these omnipresent views on individuals who are more economically disadvantaged throughout the vast majority of human existence, it is inevitable that there will be negative and degrading stereotypes enforced onto these people. Some of the most prevalent being that the substance abusers, whether it's for drugs, alcohol, pornography, or something else that's usually perceived to be low class, are both physically and mentally lazy, with a common explanation for poor people's economic condition usually relying on their supposed laziness and unwillingness to lift themselves out of their impoverished surroundings, that they do not value education, nutrition, nor fashion, though keep in mind that these stereotypes arise out of the conditions these individuals are forcibly placed into, with it being more difficult for them to actually achieve a refined sense of those things because of their financial status, and so much more. Basically, poor people have been the most discriminated against demographic throughout all of human history, both because of their prominence and the multitude of additional negative attributes that have been attached to them. And one of these additional attributes is that poor people are more likely to commit crimes, especially ones involving money and finances, such as tax evasion, embezzlement, and relevant for today's video, theft and/or robberies. As you should have known from paying attention to the previous statements I was making, the only reason why poor people may be disproportionately more likely to commit some of these crimes is because of the almost innate oppression they face from the federal government and the scrutiny from rich people. But given that the majority of people living in poverty are unlikely to deliberately choose that outcome for their lives, it wouldn't make sense to arrest and prosecute them for attempting to attain goods that they have been deprived of for their whole lives. Robberies committed by poor people should be justified, given that the rest of society essentially just robs them out of their dignity and basic necessities guaranteed to survive. However, those previously mentioned stereotypes, along with the prominent one of burglary, are always being perpetrated by the media, liberals, and conservatives who do not respect the rights of poor people and just want to find a simple way to ostracize them, including a certain man named John Hughes. Written by the previously mentioned John Hughes and directed by Chris Columbus. I know, it's like the saying the quiet part out loud this time. Home Alone was released in November of 1990, and it became not only one of the most successful and iconic holiday films of all time, but also one of the most lauded comedy films too, with it producing some of the most memorable and quotable lines and scenes in all of pop culture and movie history. It received praise from both critics and audiences, and received a nearly $480 million box office compared to a budget of just under $20 million, which led to a number of Home Alone sequels in the future, along with tons of inspirational material for the holiday, family, and comedy film genres. However, the immense success of the film is predicated on some darker themes and conceptions of certain groups of people that were used and villainized in this movie, which we have of course alluded to before. One of the main pieces of inspiration between much of the central conflict in Home Alone was supposedly writer John Hughes' belief that children were universally afraid of robbers, despite there being no evidence to support this claim. Subsequently, it was John Hughes' incompetence as a father and complete unwillingness to take care of his children that also led to the development of this film's concept, failings that were completely on him and were later transferred to an entirely different class of people. Lower class individuals who were all incorrectly perceived to be robbers because of social and stereotypical views. Along with his warped views on parental responsibilities and his bizarre perception of the role of children, John Hughes was a very conservative man who resided in the ultra-conservative suburbs of Illinois during the extremely conservative Ronald Reagan administration of the 1980s, where things like economic inequality due to neoliberal capitalism, militarized police forces, and casual racism became widespread across America. And because of these opinions John Hughes had on families, which were pretty similar to the evangelical Christian beliefs that many liberal and conservative Americans had at the time, he decided to form narratives around those views, like the inherent sacredness of families during exclusively Christian holidays such as Christmas. This was essentially the Reagan-esque propaganda that many Americans were very fond to hear during the 1980s and early 90s, with a few other John Hughes films focusing on similar topics with related, conservative themes, like the individualism and laissez-faire nature of 1987's Ferris Bueller's Day Off, or the family values propaganda of 1989's Uncle Buck, or even the male-centric gazing raunchiness and unbalanced sexual overtones in 1985's Weird Science. However, what sets Home Alone apart from these other films is how the main antagonists in Home Alone, the Wet Bandits, are treated in comparison to the other villains of Hughes films, which we will discuss more in... While it may seem obvious as to why discrimination against poor people, such as to Harry and Marv in Home Alone, is unacceptable, there is actually a larger problem present with the film's message that is more than just this. For one, not only are the bandits depicted in an almost cartoonish fashion, which again stereotype the intelligence and workability of poor people, but they are put in direct contrast to the affluent and utter bourgeois nature of the McAllister family, whose arguments and extreme bickering in the beginning of the movie should have cemented them as the true villains of this story. If we can recall the story of Home Alone, Kevin is grounded for the night after an incident involving him and his brother that managed to cause a lot of immediate damage to some of the supplies within their kitchen and overall house. Now, regardless of how intricate the McAllister family behaved in the moment, Kevin was indisputably at fault here, and should have been rightfully punished due to the amount of damage inflicted on the surrounding kitchen area, never mind that the family is rich and can easily replenish it with the gross amount of wealth they hold, but whatever. And while Kevin rightfully faces immediate punitive action for this in the form of being banished to sleep in the attic, and subsequently sleeping in and being left behind by the rest of his family, he is almost completely forgiven when the desires and actions of Harry and Marv are brought on screen. And while you may be inclined to absolve Kevin of his misdeeds as he persists several days into his punishment without a family to truly provide for him, but even in these moments, Kevin does not remain his usual innocent self. He steals and destroys objects and valuable possessions from his older brother's room, threatens an underpaid pizza delivery boy with fake gunshots and the threat of assassination, wastes food and other precious items in his house, and so much more. These are all relatively abhorrent or at the very least destructive actions from Kevin that he is only able to properly commit because of his specific circumstances. Due to the sole fact that Kevin is supposedly a totally guiltless child, he is basically exonerated from all of his wrongdoings during his time alone, especially when his actions are put into contrast with the intentions of the Wet Bandits. The pair of criminals, who seemingly have no relevance to the initial portion of Home Alone's plot, are just inserted so Kevin can be forgiven by the rest of his family at the end of the movie for managing to save the household, if you will, even though he was the initial source of all the family's trouble. It just so happens that the criminal duo are also poor, meaning that the family and the film as a whole can perpetuate the myth of their inherent criminality and greediness, as opposed to the hard-working effort the upper-class McAllister family devoted to earn such a gorgeous residence, even though that could be classified as an exaggeration of success on their behalf. And might I add, this false association between poor people and people who usually commit crimes, who are from all and every ethnic and social class, is very much present in Home Alone, and is just used to advance the plot in the McAllisters' favor, regardless of what the poor people may actually want. In fact, burglar and robber have been dog whistles invented by the mainstream American political establishments, both the liberals and conservatives, along with prominent capitalists, to unilaterally categorize poor people without their input. While most robberies are indeed committed by poor people, they do so out of a genuinely benevolent cause for themselves and their families, which can obviously be justified by the automatic oppression that they face in a monetarily based society, such as America, meaning that it is totally unfair to both refer to all of them with such negative descriptive words. Likewise, Home Alone and American media as a whole in the early 1990s was very propagandistic in their attempts to portray all criminals and poor people as villainous, and that led to some real-world consequences. And when examining this unfolding of events, the film unsettlingly parallels another viciously racist and discriminatory film released decades prior that influences a separate hateful movement of its own. we can actually create a very cogent parallel between how the events of Home Alone are depicted for our oppressed, lower-class antagonists and the unfolding of another film which seeks to discriminate against a certain group of people by unfairly categorizing and stereotyping them. One of the quickest examples that comes to mind in a darkly similar film in both its themes and story to Home Alone is the classic 1915 racist film Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffith, which, while praised for its technical achievements for the time and was widely considered to be one of the first major blockbusters in Hollywood, pioneered a tradition of telling utterly prejudiced and discriminatory narratives that persisted throughout the film industry for generations. Now you may be asking, what does an explicitly racist and biased revisionist film that completely erases and or modifies certain elements of Southern American history have to do with a family-friendly Christmas comedy movie released more than 3/4 of a century later, even if Home Alone manages to only partake in some minuscule poor person discrimination? Well, not only do both of these films ostracize the experiences and lives of certain minorities in near-identical fashions, but they both create grand narratives that romanticize certain agencies who are extremely brutal in real life in the mission to supposedly civilize and conquer these minorities, with these two agencies being the police and the KKK, who are practically indistinguishable when you think about it. Both films essentially function as propaganda for either agency and have both perpetuated discrimination against said minorities and birthed certain myths surrounding their lives and the ways in which they function with society. Now, let's analyze some distinct and very poignant parallels between both films. In Home Alone, Harry and Marv encroach upon the McAllister family home, with the only member currently residing in it at the time being Kevin, who is universally perceived as a completely innocent and helpless child, despite all of the quite despicable acts he committed that we talked about from before. This is obviously meant to be a stand-in for the honorable white woman trope present in Birth of a Nation and in racist literature and films that circulated around the same time. Despite its perception, this trope was never meant to be some sort of gracious defense of white women in the face of black emancipation. It was and still is a demeaning method and excuse that white men attempt to utilize to their advantage so they can directly harm black men and women. Likewise, this fictional trope has seen real-world consequences, as similar scenarios usually unfold whenever a black person has ever been within the presence of a white woman, such as the Tulsa Race Massacre, lynching of Emmett Till, and the Amy Cooper controversy in 2020. And in Home Alone, Kevin, whose status as a child grants him an almost automatic immunity, is meant to be the serene and untouchable white woman, while the heroic white men who supposedly save the woman from the peril are the police officers. So not only do these two films parallel each other in the way they prioritize the discriminatory message, but also in the way they convince the American populations who consume this media to treat those minorities in question. There were palpable consequences from real life that arose from the production and mass distribution of these films that managed to carry societal impacts for decades afterwards. Home Alone, along with other propagandistic productions like Law & Order, was released in 1990 at the height of America's crime wave paranoia, with this film seeking to capitalize off of the popular rhetoric of the time and to insert its own commentary, which was just a recycling of the very prominent racism and classism found all throughout American society. Likewise, Birth of a Nation was released during an equivalently contentious time period that was reflected in its subject matter, that being the Jim Crow era and the nadir of American race relations. It also included its own irreverent opinions about the current racial circumstances of the time. And that's not to mention the countless times the film inspired a number of high-profile episodes of racial violence, including the KK's own revival at Stone Mountain, Georgia later in 1915, as well as the aforementioned lynchings and massacres. And to add one more parallel between these two films, history inevitably changed for the worse when either were released. Of course, Birth of a Nation inspired pretty much every incident of racial violence that continued into the 20th and 21st century that we mentioned from before. But Home Alone, by portraying poor people as inherently criminal or dangerous, also did this, and led to anti-poor person legislation that was found in American politics for decades afterwards, especially when Obama became president. And remember, the Joe Biden crime bill wasn't enacted until 1994, so the antagonistic way poor people are depicted in Home Alone almost certainly contributed to the creation of that horrid piece of legislation that only worsened that 90s tough-on-crime paranoia and treatment of people perceived to commit crimes, who were usually either poor or black. Unlike my last video essay, which focused on a video game most of you have neither played nor even heard of, Home Alone remains one of the most popular holiday and Christmas films of all time, and always elicits positive emotions in people during that one time of year. Which means that by highlighting all of the disheartening ways it attacks and demonizes poor people, this video can seriously persuade you into avoiding and even boycotting it, as the way it depicts poor people has had and still maintains a negative effect on society as a whole. And especially since this film automatically gets a boost in popularity every December, means that we can erode its notoriety by merely ignoring this film when it comes around again. Poor people, by being a group that has received almost universal condemnation from societies due to their prevalence, will find it difficult to be accepted by said societies. Which means that, unlike other minorities and historically oppressed groups, far more effort is needed in order to erase the centuries-long discrimination they face in all forms, such as the constant negative stereotyping about them being malevolent criminals or vagrants who trespass and attempt to confiscate from valuable plots of land, like the McAllister family home, Or that poor people are all unhealthily addicted to pornographic content, which I personally don't understand, given that it's usually weirdo conservatives like John Hughes who are usually sustaining the concepts of male privacy with their sexist objectification of women and simultaneous yet counterintuitive sex shaming, but that's a story for another time. So along with bold, effective action that seeks to eliminate wealth inequality from society, the most beneficial solution to permanently terminating this cultural hatred for poor people is to rid yourself of all the stereotypes you know, given that the vast majority of them are either completely false or miscast in some way, and disregard vital context needed. And all that begins by stripping away Home Alone's coveted status as one of the greatest Christmas movies of all time, despite that just not being true. Its crude and often discouraging depiction of poor people is enough to completely ignore it, and this should really convince parents to watch something more appropriate during the Christmas time, which is an outcome we can all hope arrives sooner rather than later. After all, if the holidays are meant to provide joyous times to everyone, then why should we exclude that to poor people?